going to talk a little bit about what it means to me being a black pastor. And I'll begin with my coming into the ministry. As a young person, I think it might be helpful for someone to know that I've always felt the call to go into the ministry from a child. I was born in Oconee County, out in the rural area between Walhalla and Salem, South Carolina. Lived on a farm. My father died when I was about 7 years old. We moved to town. And about 2 years when we got into town with my grandmother, then my mother died. And about 2 years after my mother died, it might have been my grandmother died. So I was moving around, and there was an aunt that lived in town, and she took 3 of us in, the children that was left at home. And I was the youngest of all. But before that took place, even in the country, I was preaching, or we would play that, having church, and if they cut down a tree and I'd get on the stump, that'd be my pulpit. But as I moved into town, my grandmama, not my grandmother, my aunt, had 2 granddaughters who lived in Atlanta. They would come over during the summer, every summer. And so when they would come over, I'm older than both of those granddaughters. One lives in California now, and one still lives in Georgia, went back to Georgia, near Atlanta. We would have church around there even after he killed the hog. And I would be the preacher, and they would be the members. And I had a sister who was still at home at that time, and she would be in the congregation. So that was kind of the beginning of the feeling of church. That's what we played most of the times around. Because we didn't have that much to play anything else, hide and go seek and some other things, but still I was the preacher in the middle of that. And then during that time, a lady came back to Walhalla from someplace, I don't know where she was, a black lady, who was Reverend Carolyn Singleton. And she put up a mission there in Walhalla. And on the 3rd Sunday, I believe, of each month, the children would go over to her mission. She had a lot of equipment that the other black churches around did not have at that particular time. And puzzles and different things for us to do, things to play with. She had all of that. And she would go over and she would prepare snacks for us. And I had 2 buddies, I would call close buddies, Reverend Rufus Mitchell and Thomas Allen. Neither one of those were interested in going in ministry at that time, I know about, but eventually they did, because I was the first one that went into, was going to be a preacher. During that time, they had a preacher at Trinity Methodist Church there in Walhalla, who was the Reverend William M. Stokes. And before Reverend Stokes, there was the Reverend Warren M. Jenkins, about 2 years, but Reverend Stokes was there 9 years. Real up-to-date, well-dressed person who spoke correctly and held himself correctly at all times. He stayed around. Not only did he was the pastor of 2 churches, one in Walhalla and one in Westminster, but he taught school at that time. And Reverend Stokes kind of took me under his wing. But before I get to that, there was a teacher that took, with all that went on in my life, probably trauma with so much death, I repeated the 3rd grade. There was a teacher, Miss Frances Whitner. So she kept me in that grade another year, and probably she knew what was going on till I could read up to her standards. Then we moved along. But to talk about Reverend Stokes, he asked my aunt that he could bring me to Greenville to hear the late Marian Anderson. And he brought me, and I heard her in her day as she sang in the auditorium, Greenville Memorial Auditorium. And because he knew I liked singing, and so he wanted me to be exposed to a wider area. So he came from Westminster, he lived in Reverend Stokes, lived in Westminster, picked me up in Walhalla, brought me over here to hear Marian Anderson at night, brought me back to Walhalla, and he went back to Westminster, he and his wife. And he talked to me something about ministry a little more, and by the time I was in the 11th grade, I believe it was in August 1952, I had my first sermon in the church under Reverend Stokes. He got me licensed to preach. So he set me in that framework here. This was a part of the Greenville district. The white churches were separated at that time from the black churches. There was a white Methodist church. It wasn't too far from where I lived that I passed many times, going one way or the other. I knew that church, and I knew one of the white preacher was there. He's deceased at this particular time. It was Claude Evans, who was the pastor most of my time there in Walhalla, because later on he went to be a chaplain down in at some college in Texas later on. So I knew him, but he was the pastor of that church there in Walhalla, St. Luke, at that particular time. But that's as far as I knew. I knew some members who were members of that church. That's the white church. I worked for 1, 2, 3 persons who was members of St. Luke Church, working around their house as a youth at that particular time. But as I moved along, Reverend Stokes told me about Claflin College. He was gone by the time I was a senior and graduated. But I went down there on the bus, not knowing how we were going to pay for it or what was the situation, but I went on down to Claflin. And while at Claflin, I rang the bell to run the school for 3 years. When I went, the Reverend James Gadsden was ringing the bell, and I was given the job of ringing the bell after Reverend Gadsden had moved on, had given it up. So moving along in the church at that particular time, at Claflin, some of the fellows there said, well, we were going to a district meeting or conference meeting, really. And because we had been kind of put in a pattern, some other folk, and we came to wherever the annual conference was, seeking to move further toward the ministry. And by the time I was a senior at Claflin, I came to the annual conference, and after that, I got a church, 2 churches, rural churches in Anderson County. I would come to those churches. That was done in the fall. The annual conference met in the fall then. It was in 57. At that time. So I'd come to those 2 churches my senior year in that fall, no, in the 56, really, fall of 56. It was Mount Sinai and New Harmony. Mount Sinai is still open. They were out in the rural. The New Harmony has been closed and merged with another church by this time. During that time, I would ride the bus every Friday to Anderson I would stay with members of the Church of New Harmony, his wife, Mr. Harris, and she was Sister Harris. And Sister Harris was kind of what you call a local preacher at that time. She didn't have any church. But I would stay through and go back down to Claflin on, I believe it was Sunday afternoon or early Monday morning on the bus. So this happened during that senior year, and by the time I graduated from Claflin, I was in War Hollow and would get down there to Anderson to do this. So at that time, I didn't know too many white pastors. They didn't know me at that time. But as I moved along, there was a person too. I graduated from Oklahoma County Training School in Seneca. After I was down there at Mount Sinai and New Harmony for 2 years, I was pulled up and sent to Seneca, St. James Church in Seneca. And in part of that church, Merle Code, who lives in Greenville, now father, Mr. Allen Code, who was principal of the school when I graduated, he was a member of that church. I don't know whether he was instigating and getting me to come up there to Seneca at that particular time. But anyway, I ended up there, and Mr. Code and his wife sat on the second seat from the front to my right every Sunday morning for 9 years. And there was another person in the church also who taught me French. And it was interesting to be among those two people who had been a part of my bringing up in school years. And not only were they there, but also in that church was Dr. Battle, who was a medical doctor, Dr. Hill, who was a pharmacist, and Dr. Hare, who was a dentist. These were black people in that particular church. And you had some other teachers who were there also at that particular time. I did get to know the white pastor there in Seneca at the white church, but we didn't have any dealings. Claude Hopper, but I got to know him, and I knew another one after Claude left. But there was no meeting between the white church and the black church at that particular time. After being there for 9 years, I was moved. I was told at an annual conference. It wasn't asked whether I wanted to move or anything like that, but they thought it was time for me to move on. So I moved to Camden. But there was a movement within the general church at that time that the central jurisdiction, which was a total black jurisdiction, would be merged with the other jurisdictions, which were white, and that the white and blacks would be going together. So everything that happened, I didn't seek anything, but people just plucked me up at that particular time to go and move. So in Camden, things were moving well when I got there, because I followed the Reverend James Gadsden, who was 4 years ahead of me in college that I knew well. And he left and was going to Nashville, Tennessee in the general church to work for something in the Board of Education. So I got down to Camden, and everything was going extremely well. A fellow came to me while I was in Camden and was talking about housing and told me that if the church would buy the land, there's a particular spot in Camden, and that he would work through it, going to get all the papers to sign and all of that, because I knew nothing about dealing with that at that particular time. And then we have to put out some money, about $1,400, I believe it was. And I presented this to the administrative board at that particular time, and they agreed, and several churches in the church put up $100 each for feasibility study, what they were saying, and they would get the money back after it was approved. He would go back and forward to Atlanta. There was a name, Mr. Campbell, who's kind of a real estate person, and he dealt in lumber or something there in Camden. During that time, which was not an easy task in some respects, because where he was buying the land was in the historical area of Camden. And I received several letters at the church. They didn't want anything down there, especially at this housing where black people were going. But it was approved by HUD. And there's over $500,000 that was involved in this. And today I can say those apartments were built there at Camden during the time I was there. Not because I led through it, but this fellow wanted to get some money because he sold it to us to $10,000, and he got the land from us, paid us $15,000. So it was something like that. He was making money out of the deal to do this, so he did this, and also while I was there, the educational building was added on to the church. All of this was done. I think that was $40,000 was done to add that on to the church. So I was at peace. I'd been in Seneca 9 years, and I thought I was going to be in Camden for a while. But at this time, the movement had started in the general church, and the general conference had passed, merging annual conferences. There was a white annual conference and a black annual conference. I was a part of the black, the others were white. And at this time, the black bishop had been moved, which was Bishop Golden, had been gone. I knew Bishop Bowen, black bishop, who operated out of Atlanta. Bishop Harris, also black bishop, was going on. Bishop Golden had come in. He didn't get to stay too long. He was moved to be a part of the mix in the general church. So, and our bishop at this particular time was white, Bishop Paul Harden Jr. And about the beginning of the year, after I'd been there 3 years, it was going to be 3 years in June, Bishop Paul Harden gave me a call and said, "Granville, I want to send you to Orangeburg, be a district superintendent." At this time, I was 36 years old. I had no thought of being a district superintendent at this particular time in my life. Of course, they had moved 2 black pastors. One was the late Jasper Smith, had been made a district superintendent earlier, and Jack Hayward, John W. Hayward. These 2 persons had been made, and James Bradley, who was a fairly young person. All of these persons were at Claflin when I was there. They were all ahead of me, however, at Claflin then. At this time, I had a young baby on the way. And here we had 3 other children talking about moving to Orangeburg. Yet I was told this is where I was going. Well, I was sent to Orangeburg to be a part of this new thing that's coming about, the changing of the districts, the changing of the conference, merging with the whites. And so how do you do this? Evidently, the bishop or somebody else in the cabinet thought that I would be able to do it or be a part of this, or they thought that younger people could handle this maybe more than some of the older preachers who had been looking to be a district superintendent. Now, when I started out in the conference, we had what was called presiding elders. The term was changed by the General Conference as we moved along. We had administrative boards. The term was just about ready to be changed. We changed the district superintendent. The general conference was doing this. There was a change from presiding elders to district superintendents. When I was starting in the church and learning about it in Walhalla, even in Seneca, district superintendents had what was called quarterly conferences. They would visit the charge 3 times every year, which is now district superintendent, well, if there's something special, can visit more, but he has to come to the whole charge conference at least once a year. That's the difference now than what it was then. Well, you had, at the time I began and was growing up in it, you had a lot of churches, a lot of pastors who probably had finished high school and some who had not finished high school, and that only. And so all of that was a part of the church, probably black, as more so in black than probably whites. But as time moved along, a lot of things happened. So when I went to Orangeburg, I had a bunch of black pastors who was far older than I am or was, and old enough to be my father. So you have working with that situation. You had whites too. When I went down there, the districts weren't merged yet, but the conference was merged. But during my time down there was a vote, and the districts were to be merged. When Bishop Hardin came, that was a part of what he was to see was to happen. So I was there in the middle of all of this merging. Some black pastors didn't like it. Some white pastors didn't like it. So we're in the mix of all of this. And I think what Bishop Hardin was trying to do, find some persons who would be able to work along with him. So when we did that, the black pastors were on the district. We had 4. The district was large at one time. You had more than the 4 districts. One time you had 6, I remember during my time. But they whittled this down till it was just 4 black district superintendents. The late Reverend Johnny Spears was in the Piedmont district. When I was Seneca, that was a part of this. You had the late Reverend A.C. Edward Jenkins. He was on the Florence district. Omega Newman was on the Charleston district, and they were. And James Bradley was on the Orangeburg district. It was 5. And what was happening at that particular time, Reverend James Bradley, the district superintendent, didn't stay on but 6 years at that time. The Reverend James Bradley's term was up at this particular time. He was in Orangeburg. And the mixture of all of this, when they were going to cut the district further, I was to go on the New Orangeburg district. I'd been down there 4 years, and that district went from Orangeburg to Richland County, Calhoun County, Kershaw County, Sumter County, and the lower Bamberg County. I was doing all of that for 4 years, and those other, Omega Newman was doing the lower part down in Charleston, Ed Jenkins was doing the other part in the PD, so we were doing all of that at the particular times for 4 years before the conference was to merge, or the districts were to merge. When the districts merged, I was there 2 years. I did not move in the district parsonage to white, but there were 2 district parsonages. I was in one which was wasn't an old parsonage itself. and the white apostles. But I did not move. I was there. My thing was to get all of the auxiliaries in this district together. There was a lady from down at Hampton, South Carolina, white lady, was the president of United Methodist Women. There was a black lady in Sumter, president of the Black or Women's Society Christian Service, whatever they call it that particular time. So they had to merge and come together. This lady that was in Hampton, she worked in the school system down there, had a new experience, and she invited me to do a baccalaureate sermon down in Hampton when I went down there. Never been to Hampton before in my life, but I was called to do the baccalaureate sermon down there in Hampton, and the commencement message was given by the whoever was the congressman, Brian Dorn, at that particular time. So she had one to do, the white to do one thing, and a black to do another at that particular time. Then you had a white lady who was elected the president of the United Methodist Women, Virginia Moss, who lived in Cameron. Mrs. Moss and T.C. Moss, her husband, she had me to come over to their house. This was a little town in Orangeburg County, which she was a very, very special person in helping and molding the district together. And being a part of that particular district, being the superintendent with the white and blacks together, I had a group of young white preachers, plus some older white preachers, and others. And as I moved in that district, I made this statement as we had a meeting that I would be visiting all of the churches, but they wouldn't know when I was coming. So they wouldn't have to create any disturbance. I don't know what told me to do it like that, but I did it like that. And I visited most of those black church or white churches in that Orangeburg district. And I preached in several of them. And my way of visiting, I'd wait till they got ready to start church. And for most of the times in the white churches, they would be in there by the time the prelude was going on, and you didn't have too many late preachers, late comers. So I would go to church after they sat down and got going just before time for the church to start, and then I would walk in. And I would sit down in the middle of them. Some of them would hear me singing and look around and turn red and what else was going on. Went up in Calhoun County to a church, and the church wrote the bishop a letter by that time and told him that I came in and the lady hadn't been long, had a heart attack, and she almost had another heart attack up there in Calhoun County when she saw me. And I don't know what the bishop wrote back and told him. But the preacher, he didn't know I was coming either, but she lived, the lady didn't die. Up around somewhere near Aiken, I went into the church, and the person got up and left. Down in Branchfield, went in the church, got up and left. And that was about all that left. And I had one preacher still lives now, he's retired, and he lasted about it down, but he was from Alabama, Mississippi or somewhere, and he wanted to go somewhere, and he put it in the bulletin the district superintendent was going to be there over in Aiken to preach. But he didn't tell them that the district superintendent was black. And so I went over there to preach that Sunday in that church, and he talked about it after. One fellow there said he wasn't going to let no black preacher in there coming in there. He's going to do what he's going to do. And I went in to preach that Sunday and preached, and I think I must have shook his hand when I went out. I don't know. But the preacher, after he got back, was laughing, talking about it. He said he wasn't going to hear it, but he did hear it that Sunday. But the biggest crowd, I think, while being there in that Orangeburg district, was St. John's Acre, that pulpit that you walk up into. The pastor had invited me to come over there and preach. And I went. He's deceased now. And there was 600 people at that church on that Sunday when I preached over there. And on my way out, we were leaving, before the people got out, he was taking me to the front door, the preacher was, and there was a little short white lady, caught me just about in the middle of that church, going back there near the door, and she hugged me, and so nothing I knew to do but put my arms around her too, as we went out. So that was a time, and then when I went to St. Matthew, the church in St. Matthew, there was a lady there that said she wanted to meet her district superintendent. It was a white lady on that particular Sunday. So a lot of things happened on that district at that particular time. And during that time, you had some people who wanted to leave the Methodist, United Methodist Church. And so one white group came to see me, and they were mad at the preacher or something. And so they came to the district office. I said, well, I'll tell you what to do. You want to leave? I say to the preacher, if you want to get rid of the preacher, first of all, not a discipline, so you got to do a lot of reading. I said, one of the things to do, he can transfer all of you who wanted to leave church out of the church. And I remember the name of the person, the name was a Wanamaker, Larry Wanamaker, that came down there. But I didn't lose not a one of them. They stayed in that church. The preacher moved on, they were mad at him. But I took care of it, and because there had been a church that was left the Methodist, United Methodist Church in Jameson, but I didn't lose any of them. In fact, down in a little place called Utahville, there was a white person who had left the church a long time ago to the Southern Methodist Church. They came back to the church while I was district superintendent down there in Utahville. So many things happened. To move on a little further, in my last time serving as district superintendent was in Anderson, which meant I was going home. And I'll just mention that briefly, because time is flying. But going back in that particular area, especially in Walhalla, in Clemson, went to Clemson, and I was asked to preach there. The lady met me. I worked for her mother in Walhalla. I never met her, but I knew her mother, Miss Bradley, had a daughter. I didn't know what her daughter was. She was in Clemson, and she told me about it. And as a youth, I worked with her mother around the